Hello, everyone. This is Mars. I've got before me an issue of Famous Monsters of Filmland. This is the first issue. This magazine has been sort of an obsession of mine since I was about 6 or 7 years old and first discovered my first issue on the stands. It's really kind of the magazine that kind of formed me into a monster nerd. It led me into comics and films and even music. For years and years, this was my holy grail. It was this Famous Monsters #1. Over the years, the past 15 years, I've owned 3 or 4 copies of issue 1. And this is currently the only copy of the first issue I own now. And you can tell it's a little beat. You can also see it's the English variant. You can tell by the price here. But Famous Monsters came about, I think it was February of '58. In 1957, Universal released a package of films to television under the moniker of Shock Theater. They were syndicated and included were a lot of the famous Universal monsters that we know now, and a lot of rather obscure films that don't get much play anymore. But for young baby boomers, this was their first exposure to these monsters that they hadn't had a chance to see in the theater. And about this time, to kind of exploit the film package, local stations around the country would introduce horror hosts to fill out the block of time and introduce the films, usually with jokes or skits. The most famous of these being Vampira in Los Angeles and John Zackerley, who was in Philadelphia and then later New York. This was, like I said, in the late '50s, early '60s. And the horror host was pretty much a staple of independent television stations across the country up into probably the mid to late '70s. Here in St. Louis, I don't remember our horror host. I have friends who do. But it was, as I kind of came of age as a monster-loving, comic-loving nerd in the mid-'70s, I don't remember ours. But anyway, so Famous Monsters was published in, like I said, I think it was February '58, in a driving snowstorm on the East Coast. And it was intended just to be a one-shot. It was publisher James Warren and editor Forrest J. Ackerman, their baby. But the print run was quickly sold through, and they realized they had a hit in their hands, and so it was the idea was to turn it into an ongoing magazine. Here on the cover, that's actually the publisher, James Warren, in a mask, and I believe the young lady's name is Marion Moore, which I think was his secretary at the time. Let's see the cover here. So, let's open it up and see what this looks like. It's Tor Johnson's glowing visage there, inside front cover. Welcome, monster lovers. And here, for most of us, for most of America, was our introduction to Forrest Ackerman, his writing style. I'm not going to read it out loud, but the magazine was his baby, it was his voice. Ackerman loved puns, and he had a good time with his fans. He was probably writing here to 11-year-old boys. For many of us, like I said, I grew up in the 70s, so seeing these pictures of these films, this is before the age of even cable TV for me, and of course VCRs or DVDs. So seeing these films became a mission. Look at these photos. This is from World Without End. Who wouldn't want to see this movie? And so it was The Hunt. Comic collectors know about the thrill of the hunt, that they actually hunting for old back issues and stuff, and it's actually the fun part of the hobby, more so than actually owning the issues. And it was like that for us monster and film fans before the advent of the VCR. We had to hunt these films down, which meant perusing the TV guide every week. I know that personally I would always snag one when I went with my mother to the grocery store on Saturday or Sunday, and would go over it cover to cover, looking for films that usually played after 10:30 or 11 p.m., hoping to find something monster related that I had seen a still from Famous Monsters. And I still kind of have in my head sort of a canon of films that extends from The Silence, from, say, go back to Caligari and whenever that was, 1919, I suppose, all the way up through like the mid-70s in the death of Hammer Studios. It's kind of my personal Famous Monsters canon of films. Any genre film made from the beginning of The Silence to, like, say, the end of Hammer is essential viewing for me, and feels like an old friend. No matter how many times I watch it, no matter how bad it is, it might be, I have to own it. I feel like I own it. So I've seen probably most of these films now. There's still a few that have eluded me. And I have kind of an obsessive compulsion to own them when they're released in whatever new format, even if I never get around to watching them more than once or, every couple of years or so. This article, Alice in Monsterland, is just kind of an overview of horror films, and this was endlessly recycled through the life of the magazine. One thing Warren magazines were famous for was for their infamous for was for their reprints. Here's Lon Chaney Sr. Again, one of Ackerman's great achievements was really introducing these silent movie stars to fans who would never, ever get to see these actors, in theaters, or especially on television. But I was in 4th and 5th grade and was a huge Lon Chaney Sr. fan, even before I'd seen any of his films. Just through the photos and the articles in Famous Monsters. And this is Eric the Phantom from Phantom of the Opera, of course, from 1925. This, to this day, remains my favorite makeup job. I just think it's just spellbinding what this man was able to do with makeup, almost 100 years ago, to contort his face and look so ghoulish. I don't think it's still, to this day, has ever been equaled. That's just a great makeup. Here's another Chaney Senior makeup from Blind Bargain. I have yet to see this film. And the son, Chaney Jr., is Karis the Mummy. It's the Mummy's Curse. These Karis films are pretty interchangeable. They're fun, but it's pretty much the same movie 4 times. Here's Karloff as the Mummy. It's one of my favorite Karloff performances. Unfortunately, you only see this makeup here in bandages at the beginning of the film. Makeup from Tarantula. And here's another thing you'd see. Ackerman had these stills from a lot of these, especially Mexican films, that, so obscure. I've never seen this. I don't know what that even is. But he had an extensive collection of stills, of course, and used them. Stuntman Eddie Parker, I believe, doubling for Karloff and Abbott and Costello meet Jekyll and Hyde. This I have seen. This is Herman Robles in from either The Vampire or The Vampire's Coffin. It's a Cecilia El Vampiro, which are really fine Mexican horror films that would play on UHF stations back in the 70s and 80s every once in a while. So Michael Landon is Teenage Werewolf. Frederick March is Hyde, which until I think Silence of the Lambs was the only horror film to win an Oscar for Best Performance by an actor. This photo here, this film I managed to, this is from The Body Snatcher, a Mexican film. I managed to find a copy of this at bootleg several years ago. It's really a good film. And this photo was made good use of this photo. I think it's even a cover for an issue of Creepy, if I remember right, a Creepy yearbook or something. But a really effective makeup and a pretty good movie. Laurie and Mad Love. And here's a photo of some controversy. As you can see in the caption here, Ackerman says this is Dwight Fry, but it's not Dwight Fry. It's Bernard Jukes, who played Renfield in the stage production of Dracula. This photo, the great Basil Gogos, later used this as a cover for an issue of Famous Monsters. I think it was issue 18, maybe 17 or 18. The Frankenstein story, the granddaddy of all the Universal monsters. My personal favorite. And here we hear stills, a couple of stills from my favorite movie of all time. As a monster kid growing up in the 70s, going through the TV guide and seeing a listing for a Saturday afternoon showing of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein on Channel 11, 12 o'clock on a Saturday. It would usually air 3 or 4 times a year. That was Christmas for my neighborhood. The boy calendar stopped. Whatever street football games or baseball games up at the playground we would usually put together, everything was halted until after Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein. I can quote this film verbatim. I love it. It's never been equaled as far as a mixture of horror and comedy. The monsters are treated with respect. Abbott and Costello are very funny. It's a funny script. It's got a great score. It's just a terrific, terrific movie. Some publicity still for Ghost of Frankenstein. Son of Frankenstein. Karloff, the last time he played the monster, and Bela Lugosi, and arguably his greatest role is Igor, the broken neck hunchback. He is so good in this film. Teenage Frankenstein. And more Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This is actually only the second time that Lugosi played Dracula. He only played Dracula twice. The original Dracula and Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein. He played vampires, of course, several times. But never Dracula, except for these 2 films. And my battery is dying on my tablet, so I'm going to have to kind of speed through this. I didn't find this out very well. Christopher Lee. And here we have a horror host with a guy in a Don Post Frankenstein mask. From Humbug, which was one of Kurtzman's post-Mad magazines. And here's an interesting article on Paul Blaisdell. He created these bug-eyed monsters from several AIP films in the 50s in I read an interview. Supposedly there was some bad blood between Forrest Ackerman and Paul Blaisdell. I'm not sure what it entailed. Blaisdell's featured in this first issue, but he doesn't get much ink in the rest of the run, which is, you would think would be surprising for as much as he contributed to the genre. But the fact is, he actually started with Bob Burns, was involved in another monster magazine, Fantastic Monsters of the Films, which, Famous Monsters spawned endless imitators, and most of them were, were pretty crappy, and they didn't last very long. Fantastic Monsters was the exception with Castle of Frankenstein. But it was a true exception to the rule. It was a quality magazine. At the time, it even featured color photos and posters, was something that, Jim Warren couldn't afford to do in Famous Monsters. Unfortunately, there was a fire, I think, at the plant or something where they were printing it, Fantastic Monsters, and the magazine went under. But as Blaisdell was involved with that magazine, that may have contributed to the bad blood between him and Ackerman. My second probably favorite film of all time is King Kong. This was another very big deal in the 70s when this was come on TV. This was actually shown on prime time on our independent station. It was a very big deal when King Kong was on TV. And it's still maybe the greatest adventure film of all time. Here's the Blaisdell article. I was a little ahead of myself. But there's Paul Blaisdell and his wife. And it goes into the kind of behind the scenes stuff of how he made the monsters, which is something that Famous Monsters kind of originated, but would never do again with Blaisdell. Blaisdell would move this type of article over to Fantastic Monsters of the Films, where they would have articles on how to create your monsters and how to film special effects scenes and of that sort. I've got a full run of Fantastic Monsters of the Films. Unfortunately, it's not with me now. It's off at the bindery getting bound for my bookshelf. A monster is only as good as his victim. And here we have some of the famous women of horror films. And being a horror fan, probably be surprised at how few horror films I see these days. And as I said, my love for the genre kind of ends around 75, 76, 77, 78, right around in there. When Hammer Films goes out. That's with John Carpenter's Halloween, which is a great film. But it completely changed everything. Night of the Living Dead was a sea change in 68. And then 10 years later, the game really changed again with Carpenter's Halloween. These are both great films, but they really changed the horror film landscape and kind of the mythology of the monster movie and the horror movie. One I don't particularly care for. I love these monsters. I consider them my friends. They're misunderstood. But I also believe in good versus evil. And evil has to lose at the end. And one thing I was struck at seeing Halloween was we would see the film through Michael Myers' eyes. We actually see it through a mask, and participate in the killings. And something about the cynicism and, while, like I said,